the Trappings and Trinkets Knitting Podcast, and I'm your host, Nicole. If you're in the United States, did you watch the eclipse last week? We had an eclipse that went from the Oregon and kind of went southeasterly, and I think it ended up somewhere around South Carolina. So it was just kind of a line that went all the way through the country, and we here in central Illinois, we were about 3 hours away from the area that had a 100% eclipse, but still we were at about 90, I think 92%. There, of course, because everything is online, there was an eclipse calculator online that you could put your zip code into, and it would tell you like how much of an eclipse you were getting in your area. So I did that, and I think we were at like 91.8 or something like that. So that was interesting to watch. I hadn't ever seen one. I do remember very vividly that when I was in about second or third grade, we were having some sort of percentage of sun eclipse in our area, and rather than like bringing the kids out and doing a science lesson, my school just said, okay, we're shutting the blinds and we're all going to stay inside and nobody's looking out the window. So they didn't really use it as a teaching opportunity, which was kind of a bummer. I was really glad that my kids, they're both in high school, and their school did, I think they bought about 200 eclipse glasses for a school of like 1,500 kids, but they were letting the kids out in shifts during their lunch period. So I was glad that they would get a chance to go out and take a look at it. I was at home that day, and I live on it's gotten slightly younger since I've lived here, but my block is a lot of retired people, and there's one woman across the street from me that's in her late 80s, and so I noticed that she wasn't outside, and she just seems like the kind of person that might like to see an eclipse. So I went and knocked on her door when it was getting close to the time where it was supposed to be as covered as it would be. And I asked her, hey, have you ever seen a solar eclipse? And she said, well, yeah, I was going to watch it today, but it's too cloudy, because it had been raining that morning here. And I said, well, it's not too cloudy. I put on my glasses and I could see it. It's right over your house. So she grabbed her glasses and we went out and sat in her front yard and chatted and watched the eclipse together for probably about 40 minutes. So it was a lot of fun. I was very surprised because, I had seen pictures and read accounts of how it would go, and I was very surprised that it really didn't get dark, like not even at all. At the very darkest point, it was maybe the sort of darkness you would get on a slightly dreary day where it was going to rain. Like, it was not at all dark. So that was, I don't know, it was 92% covered, so I figured it was going to get dark for a minute, but it didn't at all. And there were like articles on the internet about, what's going to happen to your pet? Are they going to freak out when it gets dark in the middle of the day? And like, I don't think my pets, I'm sure they did not notice. So all of that brouhaha was definitely not meant for the areas that were going to be like 92% eclipsed. I think the next one around here is like 2024, I think they said. If you are a person that bought the eclipse glasses, though, and you don't just throw them away, because there are places that you can send them. A lot of local libraries are collecting them, and then they're going to send them to, I can't remember offhand what the name of the charity is, but I'll make sure to put it in the show notes, or maybe here in the bottom of the screen. There's a couple of charity organizations. It's something like Astronomers Without Borders or something like that. So the idea is that they get those eclipse glasses to areas that are going to have the next solar eclipse, so that school kids in those areas can use the glasses to watch it. And maybe those are kids that wouldn't, like the schools maybe wouldn't be able to afford to buy glasses for all the kids. So don't just throw them away. Try to either collect or send them to a collection at a library, or they do have an address. I'll try to link that in the show notes, where you can mail your glasses if you want to recycle them. And if you're thinking, well, I'll just save them for 2024 and watch it, watch the next one. I think these glasses do have kind of a time limit where they're supposed to be good for. So 2024 is past that time limit. So I have read that don't save your glasses thinking you're going to watch another eclipse in 10 years. You don't want to use those same glasses. So send them away to somebody that can use them. And yeah, you can feel good about making sure your glasses are going to have a new life somewhere else. So that was kind of cool. Something out of the ordinary. Shall we talk about knitting? Let's. I'll start today with my finished. Oh, I was also going to say this is my solar eclipse dress. It's not really. I made this a year ago before I even realized there was a solar eclipse. It's just my universe dress, and it's another one of my favorite sundresses that I made 2 summers ago. I think I talked maybe in episode 14 about the very basic idea of how I've made my sundresses without using a pattern. I just used an existing dress as a pattern. So if you're interested at all in that, you can see what I have to say about that in episode 14. And I'll stick a little video in here so that you can see what this sundress looks like. It's one of my favorite ones. It's a nice, cool, easy outfit, and always gets a lot of comments from people. Okay, so finished objects, knitting. My only finished object for this time is my finished pivot tank. Here is the finished tank. I changed the gauge. I used fingering weight yarn instead of DK, which is what the pattern called for. So I did do some modifications there because I had to redo the math. By the way, if you're interested in redoing the math so that you can use a different weight of yarn for your pattern, all you have to do is go to episode 15, and I do a little 20-minute lesson in that. So I redid the math and used about 2.5 skeins of the Malabrigo sock yarn. And I believe that I did like a 42, 43-inch chest on this. So that was about 4 inches of positivity. So this shirt is a larger measurement than my actual body. And it is knit in 2 big pieces. So all the stockinette stitch that you see there is one piece, and then you knit an identical piece for the back. And then you pick up for this trim and straps. So basically, you start at the bottom, you pick up along the side, you pick up along the armhole, and then you cast on some stitches for the straps. So this is another place that I modified the pattern a little bit because I did the lazy man's strap way. Because the straps are fairly small, and that's all that's holding up this, not huge garment, but it's a whole shirt. So it's not a tiny bit of yarn. These little bits of straps here are holding up about 200 grams of yarn. So I decided I want the straps to be thicker than the shirt itself. So the shirt is pretty thin. So you can see, like if I stretch it a little bit, you can see right through it. So this is not, by the way, it's not see-through when you put it on. But if I stretch it and show the light through it, you can see that this is not a super thick fabric. But the straps, if I stretch those a little bit, see how it's not the same situation? You don't really see a lot of light through that strap, even if I stretch it. So I wanted those to be a little bit thicker and a little hardier to help them not just be so stretchy and wimpy and falling off my shoulders. So what I did is I still used the same fingering weight yarn, but I held it double, and I dropped the needle size down so that it would still be a similar gauge to what I had. The trim is the same sort of ribbed pattern. I think it's a knit. Well, no, it's not exactly the same. I guess I changed that too. So I made that a knit 2, purl 1 repeat. And on the bottom here, it's just a knit 1, purl 1. By the way, that's a good way to compare. You see, when I stretch that ribbing here on the bottom, again, you can see right through it. When I stretch the strap ribbing, you don't see right through it. So you can see that this is a lot thicker. So I knit the whole tank top, I believe, on size 2 needles. What would that be? 2 millimeters? I think it is. No, it's not. It's 2.5 millimeters, I think. And I dropped down to a size 0 to do the straps because, again, since I was doubling the yarn, I had to use a much smaller needle to kind of stay in the realm of the same stitch size. So that worked out really, really well. And I just picked up at a 3 stitches to every 4 vertical row ratio, all the way up the side, all the way through the armhole. You can see here at the little corner that there is a few little increases that you do here, and that's to allow for this turn. So that's in the pattern, no big deal. And then to do the lazy man straps, what I did was I just kind of estimated about how many stitches it would take to make it from where I thought I wanted the top of the tank top to be, to go over my shoulder to where I thought I wanted the back to sit. And this really was just an estimate because I was just guessing. I was guessing based on how many stitches it took me to pick up this side, and then I took the length of the side. I divided the number of stitches by the length, and then that told me the stitches per inch. And then I measured how many inches I wanted that strap to be. I did the multiplication, and then I subtracted maybe 20% because I thought, well, if I want it, if it's too small, then that's easy to fix. If it's too big, then that's a real pain because I'm going to have to take it all out and redo it. So what I wanted was to come up a little bit short, and then when I did the back piece, did the same thing, pick up along the edge, pick up along the armhole. On the back piece, I only wanted to have to cast on a few stitches to make up that last little bit. And then I did a little, it was mattress stitch. Yeah, did a little mattress stitch. So you can see that right here is where I did the mattress stitch. So all along here, that's the front strap. Here's the back strap. And right here is where I stitched them together. And on the front, you really can't tell where that mattress stitch is. So it worked out really well. I think I only ended up having to cast on maybe like 9 stitches onto my back piece for that last little bit of strap. And the way I fine-tuned it was that after I finished the front piece with the trim and the straps, I went and I washed it, I blocked it, I let it dry, and then I actually measured how long that strap was going to be, figured out how much longer it needed to be, and did the math to figure out exactly how many stitches that was going to take to finish it up. So it actually did work out really well. I could throw it on over my dress, I guess. The neckline sits in a really nice place, and the armhole, oh, by the way, you do end up stitching up the 2 sides, obviously. I believe in the pattern they have a little bit of a split down at the bottom here, and that totally slipped my mind when I was stitching it up. I might cut that open at some point, but it's fine how it is, so I might just leave it alone. But anyway, I also fine-tuned the armhole here because, so it is a little bit lower than the armhole on my sundress. I did want to fine-tune it to make sure that my underwear wasn't going to be hanging out when I was wearing it. So again, after, I stitched it up as about the length that I thought I wanted it to be, and then I washed it, let it dry, and then did the final few little stitches to make sure it was exactly the length I wanted it to be. So when you are working on projects, just know if you want to stop and block your project and do a little bit more and make sure that everything is the length that it is supposed to be, and everything is where you want it to be. I do that all the time. A little washing in the middle of a project. Like, I can't even remember the last garment I made where I didn't wash it probably a couple times during the process of making it, and that is how I get things that fit me well. So I would rather do it that way than just make it, hope for the best, block it, and then have to take it apart and do it again. So I would much rather just stop what I'm doing, throw it in the wash, get it blocked, and be able to put it on my body and make sure that it's where I want it to be. So anyway, I was really happy with that. I would highly recommend this pattern. It was well written. There's a schematic. It has everything that I wanted to be there was there. And because it has a schematic, it was very easy to refigure the math to use whatever kind of yarn I wanted. And so that makes me happy too. So I would highly recommend the pivot tank pattern, and I would highly recommend using fingering weight yarn if you're comfortable doing the math, because it makes for a nice lightweight tank top. And I'm happy with how it turned out. So yay for that. Okay, I have a couple of works in progress, one of which is super boring, and I know I promised you some sock heel talk today, and I'm going to push that off a little bit because I have something else I want to talk about more today, and doing both of them was going to make for a super, super long podcast. So this is my very boring little no-show sock, and the reason that it's very boring is because I got distracted by something else. So no-show socks, they're coming. This is out of this crazy hedgehog fiber hula hoop colorway yarn. So these are fun to knit. I just haven't gotten to the part where I can differentiate this sock from the other two socks that I made with a different heel and ankle treatment. So we're not going to talk too much about that one. Here's my distraction. So I am working on another baby present for a college friend who had a baby in July, and her name is Sophia. So this little onesie thing is going to be for her, and I've had this on my, favorites list, the list of things I want to do for quite a while, but now that I'm 42, I don't have that many friends having babies anymore, so I was glad to have a little baby that I could knit this for. So I am making this out of Siesta DK yarn, and it's a little onesie, and it's got a little garter stitch collar, and as you can see, it buttons up the side, so it doesn't have buttons yet, but eventually it will button on that side. Right now the sleeve stitches are on holders, but I will make these long sleeve, and I think they have a little garter cuff on the bottom, and then they've got little cables down the sides. There's the other one. There's the cable on that side. And then this little eyelet pattern on the front and on the back. Those are pretty much identical. Now, the way this pattern is written, by the way, the pattern is called Trinkets, I think. And that's my best Norwegian. Trinkets. So if you're Norwegian, tell me how I did in the comments. I'm very curious. I looked up Norwegian pronunciation guide before I did the podcast, so I wouldn't make a complete fool of myself, but you'll have to tell me how close I got. And also, I couldn't find a definition, so is that like a proper name? Because I thought, well, maybe it means like onesie in Norwegian, but the Norwegian dictionary did not tell me what that word meant. It said it was not listed, so tell me if you know what that word means. I'm very curious. Anywho, the pattern is for a baby onesie that doesn't have legs. It just has the snap crotch at the bottom. But I am liking this so much, and I think it would be so sweet to be like a full onesie suit with long sleeves and long pant legs, that I'm thinking of modifying the pattern so that it is a full body onesie. I'm really, I'm liking this pattern so far. I will say I would recommend it for anyone who is a comfortable knitter. It might not be the best pattern for a beginner, and that is, it's not because any information is incorrect or missing in the pattern. It's more that the Norwegian style of writing, there's a lot less hand-holding than in the American style of pattern writing. If you are a beginning knitter who has not done a raglan pattern, or if you're someone who really wants the directions to say, row 1, knit 4, knit 2 together, yarn over, etc., etc., this is not your pattern. So it is adorable. I think it's great. I think the design is cute. The pattern is accurate. All the information is there. It doesn't really hold your hand. So those are my 2 works in progress, and my next up is a pattern that I'm going to make for my husband, and this one he actually asked for, so I was excited about that. We were watching The Handmaid's Tale, and in it, Luke, the husband, it's in the scene where they're in the car trying to run away, like at the very beginning of the of the story, they are trying to get away from the crazy things that are happening. So he is wearing, I think it's like a burnt orange colored sweater. Is it? Or is it beige? I don't know. I'll see if I can find a still shot from the show and I'll throw it in here. So when we were watching this episode, my husband was like, ooh, I like that sweater. I want a sweater like that. And this sweater was like so outside the box for anything he has ever worn or like expressed interest in. I was like, I'm not making you that sweater. You would never wear that sweater. And he said, oh, I would wear that sweater. If you make me that sweater, I'm going to wear it. So I looked on Ravelry for like kind of the qualities that this sweater had. It had a shawl collar. It had a bunch of cable-y stuff going on. And I did find a few that were in the vein of it. So I showed those patterns to Jason, and he picked a pattern called Bespoken. And so I just ordered the yarn, and, well, so here's the other thing. So I asked him, well, you know, what color, because he already has a brown sweater and a gray sweater and an orange, because that's like our town color. So I said, well, what color are you interested in now? So he said, I don't know. I have trouble visualizing how a color is going to look on a large scale. So I looked on the Ravelry projects for the sweater, and luckily it's been out for a while, and there's quite a few projects that people have already made. So I was just showing him different people's interpretations of this sweater. And there was one that caught his eye that was like kind of an army green, like a greenish khaki color. And he was like, oh, I like everything about that. I want exactly that yarn. And so I looked it up. It was Drops Nepal. And I was like, I see what you're saying. Like, I like the heathered look of that yarn too. It's a nice color. But this yarn is like, I think it's like 35% alpaca. And I think the rest is wool. And so I was like, this sweater is going to be so warm that you aren't going to want to wear it inside, like, ever. This is going to be an outdoor only sweater. And he was like, oh, that's okay. I want it. So against my better judgment, and I also warned him that it might be really itchy because some people find alpaca much, much itchier than wool. Again, he doesn't care. He's going to wear something under it at all times, so he doesn't care. So against my better judgment, I ordered the wool/alpaca yarn. And it was very affordable. I mean, Drops yarns are very affordable. So I like the look of it. It asked for, I think it was like 23 skeins. 23 skeins. Like, my husband is not 500 pounds and 7'5". He is like a normal, like almost 6 foot tall guy. I think he has like a 45-inch chest. So I'm very surprised that it told me I need to get this much yarn. And actually, I think I even ordered 1 skein less than it told me to get. But it is a really nice color, very like khaki greenish. And let's see, did I get the fiber content right? Yes, 65% wool, 35% alpaca. It's not super rustic feeling, but man, I bet this is itchy. For a sensitive skin person like me, I would not be able to wear a sweater. I would have to wear like a shirt with a collar and also a shirt with long cuffs so that the sweater could only sit on the shirt and not ever touch any part of my skin. So I'm very much looking forward to it. I do like knitting with more, I don't want to say rustic, because this doesn't have like a real crunchy feel to it, but it is, I can tell that it's a wool that's going to have really nice stitch definition. And the project that we were looking at that inspired Jason to order this yarn really did look nice. So I'm very much looking forward to starting this project. I just hope I don't get a rash while I'm knitting it. I hope I don't get a rash. So I'll let you know how it goes. So speaking of starting a new project, the thing I wanted to talk about today is swatching. So that's what I'm going to be doing soon because I want to make this sweater and I want it to fit. So I wanted to talk about swatching. When I did that math lesson in podcast number 15, I started with that only because I was getting not a lot. I would say Of people that ask me questions about knitting, questions related to either refiguring stitch numbers or how to use a different gauge, that is like the number one question I get. So that's why I made that the first little lesson that I did. But I realize that that is a more advanced lesson than some of the other things that we could talk about. So I'm going to back up, and today I'm just going to start back farther at the beginning, and we're going to talk about swatching. So, do you have to swatch? That is the question that everyone wants to know. And the answer is probably. You probably do have to swatch. I would say that I swatch probably for everything that I make that is bigger than a glove. If I was going to make a pair of gloves, I would probably just make a glove. I would give it my best guess. I would make a glove. If it didn't turn out right, I would just rip out the glove and make it with a different size needle. So that's kind of my threshold, because that is a small enough project that if it doesn't work, who cares? I'll just do it again, because that's, you know, by the time you knit a swatch, you could have knit half a glove. So I might as well just make the project. And a lot of times, like as I'm making something small like that, I might, you know, make 4 inches or so of that glove, try it on. If it's gaping or if it's really squeezing my hand, I know it's not the right size. I'll rip it down, I'll use a different needle, start back up, and then if I get that 4 inches again and it feels like it's about the right size, then I'll continue. So the way that I swatch, though, is that I cheat a lot. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes, because I'm going to say some other things first. But when I say I almost always swatch, I don't almost always swatch like this. This is not my normal way of swatching. Now for that sweater, well, no, I'll probably cheat on that sweater too. So more on that in a minute. Okay, so to answer that question, do you need to swatch? Yeah, you probably do. If you're making a scarf and it's like a, you know, like a winter scarf, and it doesn't, you know, you're thinking, oh, I'd like it to be 8 inches wide, but if it's 9 inches wide or 7 inches wide, are you going to be really unhappy? Probably not. So no, you don't need to swatch that. If you're making like a throw pillow, and you know you want it to be 12 inches square, and you're just going to fill it with fiber fill, not a pre-made 12-inch square pillow. So you know, it's something that you don't, if it's 13 inches square, okay, just throw some more fiber fill in there and it's fine. Or like a little stuffed animal, a little amigurumi kind of thing. Those projects, you don't need to swatch. I never swatch like a shawl, because a lot of those shawls are like, just keep knitting it till it's the size that you want it to be. So there are certainly things that I do not swatch. But if you're doing a hat, do you want that hat to fit your head and not be giant or not be like a super tight skull cap? Yeah, probably. So you should swatch that. But again, maybe you're thinking, well, I'll just start making that hat, and if it fits me, great, and if it doesn't, I'll just tear it out. That's okay too. That's a nice little cheat. So if your thing is something that you want to fit or be a certain size, yes, you have to swatch. Now, here's something about gauge and swatching that people get confused about when they are newer knitters or crocheters. On every ball band, you will see something like this. See all that information right there? That is telling you what the manufacturer's recommended size is. Let's see if we can get it to focus there. What the recommended size is for needles or hooks, and it's telling you what the recommended gauge is, and it also gives you information on how much the skein weighs and how many yards are in it. The recommended needle size and hook size only has to do with what like an average knitter might use for average fabric out of this yarn. Same thing with the gauge. This one says we recommend you use a US 8 needle size or an H crochet hook. And if you use that, you might come out with a gauge of about 17 stitches over every 4 inches and 22 rows. So if you take this this yarn and let's see, 82 yards, so that means about 164. So this is like an Aran weight yarn. If you take this Aran weight yarn and you want to make a hat out of it, maybe you're not going to want to use a size 8 needle. Maybe you're going to want to use like a 6, because if you're using a hat, maybe you want the weave to be very dense so that the wind doesn't get through to your ears. Maybe if you're going to use this Aran weight yarn on a blanket or like a big wrappy shawl, maybe you're going to use a bigger needle because you want the weave of the fabric to be a little more open. So this ball band is only telling you what an average knitter, meaning like average tension, is going to use to get whatever their average gauge is. So don't look at the label here and say, well, my pattern says I need 16 stitches or 19 stitches, and this says it's 17 stitches. I can't use this. Yeah, you probably can if you just slightly modify your needle size. Now, if this gauge said 22 stitches and your pattern is asking you to get to 18 or 17 stitches, it's probably not the right yarn for that pattern. But then you probably have chosen a yarn in the wrong weight category. So that's a whole different issue. My point here is just that you should not look at the ball band and say, like, that is the only gauge and the only needle that I can use with this yarn. That is absolutely not true. Whatever pattern you're doing, the designer of that pattern has a specific idea in mind of the kind of gauge that they want for whatever garment or project you're going to make. And that idea may not be just the average idea that the yarn company is using to put that information on the ball band. So the ball band is not gospel as far as the needle size and gauge goes. It's just kind of a ballpark. It's just giving you a very average idea. And try not to say, well, I'm an average knitter, so I'm probably going to get that gauge. No, you may or may not, but it's really difficult to know if you're an average knitter. Like I've had people say, I always get gauge. Like whatever the needle size is in the pattern, if I use that needle, I always get gauge. If you really believe that, I think that you don't measure your gauge very well, because I can't imagine that happens. I've knit all kinds of patterns, and sometimes I can tell, like, oh, the designer of this pattern must be a very tight knitter, because they are, like, the needle size that they're asking for, I am never going to get that gauge if I use that needle size, because I think of myself as an average knitter, and the reason I think of myself that way is because when I run test knits on my patterns, I am very often in the majority as far as what people are using for needle sizes. So that's one of the questions I ask my test knitters after they're done with the project is, what needle did you end up using to get gauge on this pattern? And I do that to make sure that the needle that I am suggesting to people is kind of the average. So there will always be a few people that say I had to use a smaller needle. There might be people that say I had to use a slightly larger needle, but the bulk of the people that do the test knit will usually say I used the same needle size that you recommended and I got gauged. So that tells me that I am kind of in the middle of the pack there as far as my tension goes. Okay, now I've totally lost my track. So, that was about the ball band. Yeah, that's not gospel. It's just a generalization. When you do your swatch, this is very important. You want to use the same needle that you're going to use for your pattern. And that means not only the same size needle, but if you're going to use your metal needle with the nice flexible cable, you should swatch with exactly that needle. You should not use your bamboo needle in that same size to do your swatch. You should also not use your metal needle with the very rigid cable to do your swatch. I know that probably seems weird because you think, well, they're both metal needles. It makes a difference. The flexibility of the cable can make a big difference in your gauge. If you have plastic needles or acrylic needles or carbons needles or whatever, use the exact needle that you are planning to use for your project when you do your swatch. You also want to use the same yarn. Don't pick, if you're going to do a worsted weight sweater, use exactly the yarn that you are going to make the sweater out of. Don't say, well, I have some Cascade 220 and I know that's worsted. I'll see what that gives me. That is not the same yarn. You have to use your yarn that you're going to use for the project. And this seems really weird, but you also need to use the same colorway. So if you have white yarn in the same brand, the same weight, everything is the same except, let's say if I had ordered a ball of Nepal drops in white to use for swatching, but I'm going to make my sweater out of the green color, I might get a different gauge off of that ball of white yarn. And the reason is because, well, from one color to the next, sometimes even just the dyeing process can make that yarn act a little differently. And in the case of like white or gray or one of those natural colors, maybe you're even doing dyed yarn like the green as opposed to an undyed yarn like the gray or white or something like that. So the dye can make a difference in the thickness of the yarn and therefore the size of your gauge. So use exactly the same yarn. You want to use the same method, which means flat knitting versus knitting in the round. Sometimes you will want to use flat knitting if you're doing like a cardigan or a scarf or anything that's knit flat. Sometimes you're going to think, well, I need to do a swatch that's in the round. Like this, it kind of looks like the beginning of a sleeve. So if you're making something like a sleeve or a hat or a sweater knit in the round, you want to swatch in the round. For some people, they might realize that their gauge is different. Doing it in the round versus knitting flat. And when you do a sweater in the round, usually it's in the round up to the armholes, and then anything above that is knit, on the front, and then also knit separately on the back. So you might need to swatch both ways. Swatch in the round and then swatch flat. And you may have to change your needle size to continue to get the same gauge. So everything needs to be the same, including the same stitch. And maybe that's kind of obvious, but if your usually patterns will say this is the gauge in stockinette stitch. Sometimes if your pattern is covered in some sort of texture, then your gauge is going to say, here's the gauge, do it in the 2x2 rib stitch or the cable pattern or whatever the overall texture is. So you do need to look and make sure that you're doing it in the stitch that they're asking for, because the gauge is usually going to be very different stockinette versus some sort of texture pattern. So make sure you're doing all the things the same when you're swatching as you're going to do when you make the actual pattern. The size of your swatch matters quite a lot. Back when I was a very beginning knitter, I used to make swatches like this. Do you make swatches like this? Little 4 inches by 4 inches. If I was really being a good girl, I might make 6 inches by 6 inches or something like that. But these are very old swatches. They're very lovely yarn though. These are both Quince & Company. I believe this one was Chickadee, and it's very washed out on the screen there. It's a much sunnier yellow. And then that one's pretty close. This was the Turn yarn that has some silk in it. I like that a lot. You can see how there's like little white splotches, and that's because the silk picks up the dye differently than the wool that it's blended with. So really pretty yarns. Highly recommend Quince & Company. Anyway, it was about the size of the yarn. As I became a more experienced knitter, I started doing larger swatches. Like this one actually is, this was a test swatch for 3 different needle sizes. I think this was for a dress pattern that I made, and I was trying to decide what I wanted the fabric to look like. So I started out here on like a size 3 needle, and then you see those little bumps right there? That means I changed needle size. So then this section was a different needle size. I think it was smaller because you see how the yarn gets, or the sides of the swatch gets a little narrower towards the middle. And then there's another little group of bumps. And so this is a different needle size up at the top. So the way that, or the reason that I do it that way is because then I can just continue to knit on my swatch, and I can make it a little bit bigger, so that makes it easier and more accurate to measure. And because I grouped them all together, I kind of saved myself the trouble of having to make 3 different swatches, and I was still able to see what that yarn looked like knit up with 3 different size needles. Sometimes if I think I'm going to kind of sit on the swatch for a while and have to come back to it, I will make these little bumps correspond to the needle size that I was using. So I think I see 3 purl bumps there, and up here I think I see 2 purl bumps. So that means that this section was knit on a size 3, this section was knit on a size 2, and I'm guessing, because I didn't put purl bumps up at the top, I think this must have been a size 4, because this end looks a little bit wider than the beginning end. So I think I must have gone to a larger size up at the top. So please knit a large-ish swatch. I would say 6 inches is like the bare minimum. And if you're doing something like a sweater, I would make it even bigger than that. I have this swatch that I made. I'm not sure what I made this for. This might have just been to test out the yarn. But this one is I think it was knit flat and then I seamed it up. I have no recollection of this at all. But because it's knit in the round here, I would say this is about 6 inches across, which means I was making a 12-inch swatch when before I flipped it over and seamed it together. So this is a nice good size swatch. When you have something as wide as 12 inches, it gives you enough room from being in toward the edges that your stitches really can stretch and move around the way they would in a larger project. So when you're measuring, this is a good point, when you're measuring your swatch, you want to make sure you're not measuring too close to any edges. Like make sure you're at least a couple inches in from any edge. And you want to measure in a couple different places if that's possible, because sometimes you won't get exactly the same stitch number when you measure in one place versus another. And if you don't, then you want to kind of use the average of those 2 or 3 different measurements. So this was a 12-inch. Most often, here's the way I cheat when I'm doing garments. I will actually make an educated guess. And the reason I can do this is because I've knit long enough now that I know I can generally predict with pretty good accuracy what sort of gauge I'm going to get with any weight of yarn and needle. And a lot of the yarns that I've used before, so I can look back at projects that I've already made out of that yarn and see what my gauge was there. So I can do a pretty good job of predicting. And I'll actually just start a sweater. I'll knit 4 or 6 inches. I'll take that bit of knitting still on my needles. I'll just pull it, to the middle of the needle and let the end stick out. I'll put that in some water, wash it out, and, a little soak, or you can let that soak, dry it out, lay it out on my blocking table, and then I'll actually measure it on the needles. When I'm measuring it, I'll kind of stretch it out a little bit again, or not stretch it, but like make it so that it lays flat, and then I'll measure it. And if I'm really close to gauge, then I'll continue with the project. If I'm not very close to gauge, then I will rip it out and start over again. So if you're a person that is okay with ripping things out, or a person who is not super concerned with how something's going to fit, then this might be an easy way for you to cheat. Start your project, make an educated guess, and then wash it when you're just a little bit into your project to see how things are going. So that is pretty much, I would say I almost always do that now. With this sweater for my husband, I'll probably use a different cheat, and that is, I'm pretty sure this pattern is pieces knit separately and then seamed together. So if the sleeves truly are knit separately, I might start with a sleeve and knit up a sleeve or knit up half of a sleeve and wash that, and I'll just use that as my swatch. because it's not a tragedy if I have to remake a sleeve. But I would rather do that than cast on like a 48-inch circumference of a sweater, or it'll be knit flat, I think, because it's a cardigan. So I don't want to cast on 48 inches of anything and then have to pull it out and start over again. A sleeve would be a much more manageable thing to do that with. So yeah, I'm probably not going to make like a square swatch for this sweater. Okay, you want to measure that swatch. If you do make a swatch, you want to measure it before you wash it and then measure it again after you wash it. And the reason is because as you're knitting your project, you could measure it while it's still on the needles and say, oh, well, that's strange. My gauge is a little bit different than it was when I knit that smaller swatch. When I block this, it's probably not going to come out with the same blocked gauge. So if you measure it before and after, then that will give you a number to look at when you are actually making your project, that you can double check yourself to make sure that things are still going the way they're supposed to go. If you just throw it in the bucket of water and wash it and then measure the gauge and go, okay, it's great, well, then there's a possibility you're going to knit that whole sweater, and lo and behold, maybe that needle size isn't going to work for you anymore. Maybe you get stressed out in the middle of making your sweater. Maybe you take it on vacation and you're laying on the beach and you're super loose and your tension gets very loose, and then your gauge gets really big. So that kind of stuff happens. It's happened to me before. So I know that that happens, and if you know what your gauge was pre-washing, then you'll have something that you can measure against, and so you can reassure yourself, oh, yep, I'm right on target. I know I'm exactly on gauge. So before and after, measure it both times. Here's how you fix your gauge. If you make a swatch and you say, oh, I'm going for 18 stitches over 4 inches, but I'm getting 20 stitches. That means your stitches are slightly too small, so you need to use a bigger needle. If your pattern says you need 18 stitches over 4 inches, but you're getting 16 stitches, that means your stitches are too big. So you need a smaller needle. Too many stitches, use bigger needles. Not enough stitches, use a smaller needle. I was going to show you a few swatching ideas. Here, this is my stack of oddball swatches that I've kept over the years. Like I said before, maybe if you're making a sweater, you want to just start with a sleeve. Because hey, maybe you'll get the right gauge and you'll just get to continue. Maybe you'll get the wrong gauge, but you won't have too much to redo because it's just a little old sleeve. And I certainly don't do the whole sleeve. I'd maybe make 4 or 6 inches of that sleeve, wash it, see how it's going. You could leave the needles right in there. Just throw the needles in the bucket. I do that all the time with my metal needles, and like they don't rust or anything. I don't generally do it with bamboo, but that's only because I don't use bamboo needles. You might want to, like when the cable and the fabric is in the wash bucket, you may just want to make sure those needle tips are outside the water. I'm not sure that the water would damage them if you left them in there for a couple minutes, but you know, precaution. Try something small like a sleeve of a sweater. Or if you're making a hat, and if a hat is a big project for you and you want to swatch to make sure you're on gauge, maybe make a baby hat before you begin. Or, you know, just cast on half the number of stitches. But honestly, if you're making a hat, just make the hat. Here's a little swatch that I did to test out a stitch pattern. If you're working an unfamiliar stitch pattern, maybe you want to do a swatch only for the purpose of kind of testing that out and seeing how that's going to work. So I would highly recommend unfamiliar stitch patterns should get their own little swatch so that you know what you're doing when you start making the pattern. So this is a little smocking stitch from a dress called the Charlotte dress that has this all over the bodice. I love it. It's probably my favorite baby dress that I've designed. It is not my most popular baby dress design, but it should be. I don't know why it's not. I don't know, maybe people are afraid of it because they think, oh, that looks difficult. It's really not difficult. And I put a video on YouTube to show you how to do it. So if you aren't sure you can follow written directions, just watch the video. It's very simple. So here's another one where I was just swatching to see what that texture would look like. And another texture out of that same yarn. Let's see, that one's not very exciting. As I became a more experienced knitter, my swatches got bigger. Here's one where I was kind of trying to decide whether I should use a texture or whether I should just use stockinette. Ooh, no, that has a texture, doesn't it? Or stockinette stitch down here. I think I was thinking of designing a men's sweater, and I was kind of looking for what I wanted to do there. So that's bigger. And then here's a couple swatches that I used when I was learning how to steek. So this was for the Leap of Faith sweater pattern that I made. And I just knit a very small cylinder. This was knit in the round. And then I did the steeking treatment and cut it open. And look, nothing is falling out. You see those edges? When you steek something, it's not scary. The edges stay completely intact. There is nothing holding those edges in except for these little crochet chains of yarn. And as you can see, they stay right there. Like I can rough up those edges, I can stretch them, I can, really mess with them. And look, they just stay. Nothing is falling out. So if you're afraid of steeking, you have nothing to be afraid of. Your sweater is not going to fall apart. If you follow steeking directions, and you're either going to do a crochet reinforcement chain, and by the way, I was not a crocheter I'm still not really a crocheter, but I totally had not crocheted at the time that I made this sweater. And I figured out how to do this. So if I figured it out, you can too. I promise. The other choice is to do a sewing machine reinforcement. That makes me nervous to put a knitted fabric in my sewing machine, just because there's been so many times when I've been sewing fabric and then the bobbin gets messed up and then there's a big tangle. So that just, that makes my heart stop to think about putting my knitted stuff in a sewing machine. But you do you. If you're not afraid of sewing machines, you can do that. Here is a swatch that I made. This was for a crocheted project, and it's different little motifs. You can see there's 6 little squares here. So I was honestly just learning how to crochet. So that's why I made this little swatch. And it was very helpful. It showed me how big each little square was going to be, and it helped me figure out how I was going to do that pattern. So this was a shirt that I made. It turned out, I did it in orange yarn, and it turned out really well. This is for a hat pattern, I think. Oh no, there was gloves that went with it. So yeah, I must have been trying to figure out how that color work pattern was going to work for the gloves. And another one that I swatched for a cowl, that's like a lace pattern. This was a swatch that I made for the beekeeper's tank. And if you're familiar with that pattern, you will recognize this. Oh, sorry, the camera's blowing out the white color on this. You'll recognize this honeycomb pattern here as being right around the chest of the tank top. And the reason I made this swatch is because I needed to know how much smaller this pattern's gauge was going to be when it compared to the stockinette stitch. So you can see that this really pulled in the size of the fabric. The stockinette stitch area is a lot wider than this textured area. So in order to write the pattern, I needed to know what the ratio was between those two. And then this is a pretty good estimate of how big I would make a swatch now that I'm a more experienced knitter. This was for a design that maybe it'll get made one day. I haven't done it yet, but I still have an idea, and I would still like to make this. I was swatching it because I was unfamiliar with this lace pattern, and I wanted to modify a little bit. So the first step that I do when I'm trying to modify something that I'm not familiar with is that first I make it the way I found it. So like this one I think I found in a Stitch dictionary. So I knit a nice big swatch. This might be 10 inches by 6 inches or something. And then I can imagine what I want it to look like, and I know how to make the stitch pattern, so I can do a little modification and make it look slightly different the way I want it to look. So this is a good size swatch. When you're making swatches, the width is more important than the height, and that's because the stitch gauge is almost always more important than the row gauge. So a lot of times I'll make my swatches wider and then not super tall because priorities. That's why, priorities. So I recommend you do the same. Make sure that your stitch gauge is accurate. If your row gauge is a little off, well, you can probably live with that. Okay, that is all the swatches that I brought to show you. Here's a few things I wrote down to keep in mind. When it comes to having yarn to swatch, sometimes that extra bit of yarn is included in your pattern estimates, but sometimes it's not. So there's really no way to tell for sure. Just know that if you swatch, you can untangle that swatch and reuse that yarn. So you don't say, I'm not going to swatch because I bought just exactly the amount of yarn that's needed for this pattern. It's fine. You can recycle yarn. It'll be a little lumpy when you knit it because unless you want to like unravel it, wash it, leave it to dry, like let it straighten out, you can do that, but you really don't need to. Once you have that knit back up and you wash it again, it's going to look just the same as all the rest of the yarn in the pattern, so don't worry about that. Whatever yarn you use to swatch with, you can also use in your project itself. Stitch gauge, like I just said, is way more important than row gauge, almost always. One place where you do have to be careful is when you're doing a raglan sweater, because the row gauge dictates how deep your sleeve depth is going to be. So if your row gauge is off, you could end up with a sleeve or with like an armpit that is way too short, not way too short. It's going to be a little too short and it's going to kind of crowd your armpit, or it's going to be a little too big and droopy. So in that case, if your row gauge is different than the pattern row gauge, you want to keep a close eye on that, and you may have to make a little modification if it is a little bit too tight or a little bit too loose. Just know that that's one of the only places that row gauge is really going to make too much of a difference, because most patterns I find they will say, you know, knit 8 inches here or knit 6 inches, and they're not really saying knit 16 rows or knit 82 rows. They just tell you the distance that you need to knit. Very big garments, and I'm talking like a coat or a dress or maybe a big cardigan made out of heavy yarn. Those garments might need something called a weighted gauge, and what that means is when you swatch, also cotton yarn can need this. Just because cotton yarn tends to stretch when you wear it. Like you might start the day and your sweater is at waist length, and then you go through your day and by midday it's halfway down your butt because cotton stretches. So when you swatch for a garment like that, you want to hang your garment up. Like you could use like those pants hangers that have the little clips on them. Hang your swatch from something like that, and then I take a ball of yarn, of the exact yarn that I made that out of, and I take a knitting needle and kind of weave it through the swatch and through the ball of yarn, and that just gives a little extra weight to that swatch, and then I hang it up and leave it to dry. And what that does is it stretches the yarn kind of in the same way that the weight of the garment is going to stretch it once it's worn. And so when you measure that swatch, it's going to have a much more accurate gauge. It's going to give you a bigger row gauge and a smaller stitch gauge, because as the weight of the garment is pulled down, the stitches are going to get closer together because they're getting longer. So that's just something to keep in mind if you're making something large or very heavy. There is no need to cut the yarn when you make a swatch. Just leave, like I would just leave my swatch attached to my ball of yarn, throw the swatch in the water while the yarn just sits there right next to the bucket, wring it out, lay it out to dry, while still all attached to the ball of yarn. Sometimes I'll bind it off, sometimes I'll leave it on the needle, but instead of, if I do bind it off, instead of cutting the yarn and pulling that last little tail through the stitch, I would just kind of tie a little knot there that I can untie once I'm done with the swatch. And that is so I can easily reuse that yarn if I decide to use it in my project. And I almost always do. That's why all these swatches are like 6 years old, because more recently than that, I usually don't keep the swatches. I just unravel them and then begin my project. If I actually swatch this way, which we've already talked about how I'm a cheater. So a lot of times I don't even have a swatch to unravel. So you don't need to cut it from the ball, because then that's just extra ends to weave in. Nobody wants that. No. We talked about blocking on the needles. Here's something that we need to talk about. So podcasters, you are spreading lies, because I have watched more than one podcast in the last couple months that have talked about, well, I'm not going to wash this swatch. I'm just going to steam it. And that'll be my blocking. When you steam that sweater swatch, does that mean you are planning on never washing your sweater? Are you only going to steam it when it's dirty? When you spill something on it, or when your baby pukes on it, or when the armpits get all stinky? Are you only going to steam it forever? I don't, like, there's no garment that I would wear that I would think steaming is a legitimate way of cleaning it for my entire life. So unless you're knitting something like, again, a throw pillow or a little doll or stuffy kind of thing, you need to wash your swatch. Do not steam it and say, oh, that's good enough. That is not good enough. You have to wash it. If you ever think you're going to wash the final product, even something like a hat or gloves, you may think, oh, I'm not going to wash my gloves. Well, what if you have to end up changing your tire and you're wearing your gloves? You might have occasion to decide to wash your gloves. So don't think that steaming is a legitimate substitute that's going to give you the same results as submerging that fabric in water and washing it that way. So I don't like that the podcasters are saying that steaming is the same, because it is not. Again, if you are washing something that can be dried, make sure you are drying your swatch. And in this case, I don't recommend leaving it on the needles, and I don't recommend leaving it attached to the ball of yarn. If I have to throw a swatch in the dryer, I am binding it off. I am, taking the tail and pulling it through the last stitch and weaving in the ends to make a self-sufficient swatch that I can throw in the washer, throw in the dryer, and not have anything attached to it. Now, that almost never happens, because I very much do not like to put my hand knit garments in the dryer. The only exception for that has been linen yarn, and I've used a couple different linens. One of them was a Shibui linen. I can't remember the name of it. It's like 100% linen from Shibui, and the other one was Quince and Company's. What's their linen? I don't know. It's escaping my brain, but they have 100% linen yarn. So both of those, the reason I'll put the linen in the machine wash and then also machine dry it is because the linen, it just gets softer. Every time you agitate it or mess with it, it really does get softer. And that fiber does not have a tendency to get fuzzy. Superwash wool, most of the ball bands will say, yeah, go ahead and throw this in the dryer. You can do that, and if you do that, make sure that you put your swatch in the dryer too, so that it's giving you the correct gauge. In my experience, I made a sweater out of Barocco Vintage. I wore it for a couple of winters. It looked beautiful. I think it was probably 2 or 3 years before I used my gleaner on it to get any pills off of it. So it really was not pilling. It was very smooth. The yarn held up really well. And I was talking to my sister on the phone one day, and somehow this subject came up. And she was saying, oh, yeah, I made a sweater for my daughter a while back. Maybe it was just that year. Like, it was only a few months old. And she said, it just, like, the yarn just didn't hold up very well. And I asked her what kind it was, and she said Barocco Vintage. And I was like, oh, that's very strange because I made something out of exactly that yarn. Now, they were 2 different colors, but that's the only difference. I made something out of that yarn, and it has held up really well for a couple years now. And I asked her how she washed and dried it, and she said, well, I think she said she threw it in the washing machine and in the dryer because that's what the ball band said. And it was very obvious that it's just, you know, all that agitation did not work well with that particular yarn. So just because a ball band says that you can dry something, that doesn't mean that it's going to look nice when it comes out of the dryer. Basically what that means is that you're not going to have a huge amount of shrinkage. Like, it's not going to felt your sweater if you put it in the dryer, but it might turn it into a pilly mess. So I really don't recommend putting anything other than linen, like 100% linen. I even use, like, I've done things out of hempathy, and that one isn't, maybe that does have linen. I think it's hemp, cotton, and maybe linen is the 3rd fiber in there. But because of the cotton content in there, I don't put that in the washer. No, I do put it in the washer. I don't put it in the dryer. And that's just how I treat hempathy. I don't know. That's what I'm comfortable with. You do you. It's fine. But if you use a yarn and it comes out of the dryer a pilly mess and you want to take those pills off and try again, just don't put it in the dryer next time. But you want to do your swatching the same way you're going to do it for your final project. The last little note I have here is that small differences can become big differences. So here's what I mean. Let's say that you are doing a sweater and the pattern says you need 20 stitches over 4 inches. And you swatch and you get 19 stitches over 4 inches and you go, oh, that's good enough. Well, here's the math on that. Let's say we're doing a 40-inch sweater. So your bust measurement is 40 inches. So 20 stitches means that it's 5 stitches per inch because 20 divided by 4 is 5. So if you have a 5 stitch per inch, 40-inch sweater, that means you're casting on 200 stitches. But that same 200 stitches, if you are going to use this new gauge, which is 19 stitches per inch, that means instead of having 5 stitches per inch, you have 4.75 stitches per inch. So if you take that 200 stitch circumference and you divide it by 4.75 stitches, now instead of a 42-inch circumference, instead of a 40-inch circumference sweater, you have a little over 42 inches. And now for some styles, that might be okay, but that is an extra 2 inches of fabric. You might think, oh, I'm only 1 stitch off. That's hardly anything. Once you multiply it by a whole sweater circumference or something even bigger like a blanket, it's going to be a couple inches. So just be careful about gauge. You really do want to be right on for the stitch gauge. Row gauge, again, that's a little, you can fudge that a little bit, but for stitch gauge, you want to be right there. So I think that I've covered what I know about swatching. Again, your basics are, do you need to swatch? Yeah, you probably do. Do you always need to swatch in a tiny little 4-inch square like this? No, that's almost never appropriate. There's a lot of ways to cheat, and if you're going to do a smaller swatch, you want to make it at least like maybe 8 inches. That would be a good square size, or at least 8 inches wide and maybe 4 or 6 inches tall. Stitch gauge is much more important than row gauge, and you want to make sure you swatch exactly the way you're going to make your sweater. Same needle size, same exact needles, same exact yarn, same colorway, same method, same stitch. Everything should be exactly the same. Same washing treatment as you're eventually going to use for that project. Same drying treatment as you're going to use for that project. So I think that's the basics, and that's all I got for you today. So I'm glad that you joined me, and I hope that I helped you learn a little bit more about swatching. And if you have any future questions or topics that you'd like me to cover, I have a list going, and I plan on doing this in the future. But if there's a question that you have had that you would like a little lesson on, leave me a comment or send me a message. I'd be happy to consider that for a future topic. So I hope you have a wonderful couple weeks, and I've enjoyed spending time with you. So I hope to see you back next time. Bye!